folks, and welcome to the Horror Corner. This week we have a very special episode. We are counting down the top 10 slasher films of all time, a very important genre in the history of horror, the slasher film. And we're going to start out with some honorable mentions, as I like to do, and I'm going to start off with Wolf Creek, which I feel is the best slasher film of the new millennium. Based on real-life true events, the Australian backpack killer played brilliantly by John Jarratt as the maniac Mick Taylor. Next up we have released during the golden age of the slasher genre, and that is The Prowler, which came out in 1981. Featuring awesome gore effects by the legendary Tom Savini, who you will find on this list quite a bit, because he's an absolute master at his craft. And he's used a great effect in this film, The Prowler. Awesome slasher movie. Go check it out, folks. Next up we have the Scream Queen Jamie Lee Curtis in Terror Train. Another great slasher film from the early 80s. Starring the goddess of horror herself, Jamie Lee Curtis, and what I feel is her best slasher film outside of Halloween. Next up, of course, you gotta mention Scream, which absolutely revitalized the slasher genre in the 1990s. Before Scream, folks, the slasher genre was almost completely dead because we got nothing but sequels to legendary franchises that just had lost all their value. So Scream completely brought the slasher genre back into the spotlight. Thank goodness for Scream by Wes Craven. Next up we have Jamie Lee Curtis once again, the Scream Queen, in one of her best slasher films, and that is Prom Night. Also featuring the legendary Leslie Nielsen, pre-Naked Gun before he became a comedy star. He was actually a pretty serious actor, and he's used a great effect in Prom Night. Excellent slasher film. Another of the whodunit type slasher films. That's what I love about it. And now let's get to the top 10 slasher films of all time. And this one I only recently found out about it, but I understand what all the craze is about because it is definitely one of the best slasher films, and that is The Burning. With early appearances by Jason Alexander from Seinfeld and the great Holly Hunter. How about that? Another great slasher film featuring excellent effects by Tom Savini, the master of gore and makeup effects. Cropsey is the antagonist of this film. He's terrorized by these pranksters at the summer camp, and he's actually burned alive, but he comes back for his revenge, of course, equipped with his garden shears, as he uses to great effect on an unsuspecting group of teenagers at the summer camp. What a classic scene in the raft when Cropsey rises from the river and takes them all out one by one in most grisly, gruesome fashion. The Burning, folks, in at number 10. Next up, we have I Warned You Not to Go Out Tonight, Maniac. From 1980, starring Joe Spinell from Taxi Driver and the Rocky films. He puts in an awesome performance. Definitely influenced highly by Psycho, obviously, because he has a deep obsession with his deceased mother. Which drives him to kill, to take out unsuspecting victims in the streets of New York City, in what I call the sleazy slasher film. This is the mother of all sleazy slasher films. Movies like The Toolbox Murders, The Nightmare, The New York Ripper, which all show that real dark, seedy underbelly of the city. And none shows that to greater effect than this film, Maniac. And once again, an awesome performance by Joe Spinell, as the madman who scalps young women and uses their scalps for mannequins and dresses up the mannequins in their clothes. It's really disturbing and really demented. So get it, Maniac, folks. Next up, the most famous slasher film to never have a sequel, and that's gotta be My Bloody Valentine, coming out once again in the golden era of slasher films. What an iconic look for a boogeyman too, that mining outfit, love it. Equipped with his pickaxe. So what happens in My Bloody Valentine? There's a huge mining accident where the supervisors abandon their posts and the miners were crushed by the rubble. And there's one lone survivor named Harry Warden who goes completely insane and is institutionalized due to the events. And what happens is that mining accident took place on Valentine's Day, where the supervisors were during the time. So Harry Warden gets his revenge on Valentine's Day with a grisly message from a box of chocolates showing a human heart. And what a way to send a message showing that the madman, the evil killer miner, coming back for his revenge in My Bloody Valentine. Next up, we have what I feel is the most fun slasher movie of all time, and that is Sleepaway Camp. Also, I can really relate to the character of Angela, as I was just like her as a kid. Shy and reserved, always sitting in the corner, not speaking to anybody. So I can really relate to that. And also the movie does have a dark tone in the second half. Starts out really lighthearted and fun, campy with the 80s cheese. There's so much fun, over-the-top, campy B-movie acting, but it's used to great effect. There's such a charm to it. It's hard to explain, but I love it. So Sleepaway Camp, one of the most fun slasher movies of all time. Next up, definitely one of the most influential slasher movies of all time. It didn't have that much of an impact when it came out, but boy, you can see the influence this has now. And that is Black Christmas. With great performances by Olivia Hussey, Margot Kidder, and the great John Saxon. Directed by Bob Clark, who ironically also directed A Christmas Story. Talk about the complete opposite. So here you have that holiday-themed slasher movie, which came out in the mid-70s. So predated Halloween. And what a huge influence it had on Halloween, because you got that point of view shot at the beginning, especially from the perspective of the killer. Highly influential on Halloween. And you had that one lone madman, that one slasher killer, who makes these demented prank calls to these women at their sorority house. Sorority house, another huge cliche of slasher films. How many sorority house massacres have there been? Quite a few. Quite a few slasher movies have used that premise. But this is the best of them all. Definitely Black Christmas is a great slasher film and highly influential, and I highly recommend it. Next up, The Great Nightmare on Elm Street, directed by Wes Craven in his absolute masterpiece. What a great, ingenious premise this is. A child murderer is tracked down by the parents and burned to a crisp. But when he dies, he comes back as something much worse. He terrorizes young teenagers in their dreams. And when they die in their dreams, they die for real. Excellent performance by Heather Langenkamp as one of the great final girls in Nancy. And of course you have the great Robert Englund playing one of the most iconic villains in horror film history, Freddy Krueger, in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Next up, we have the legendary Friday the 13th. Of course, you have to put that on the top 10 slasher list. The legend of Jason Voorhees begins here, folks. also starring, surprisingly, Kevin Bacon. But what a great performance by Betsy Palmer as Pamela Voorhees, the mother of Jason Voorhees. And I just love how it's a whodunit, which is probably my favorite type of slasher movie because they keep alluding to different people possibly being the killer throughout the movie, but you don't actually know until the final reveal at the end. And so Pamela Voorhees is the mother of Jason, who drowned at Camp Crystal Lake, and the camp counselors weren't paying attention, so they just let him drown. And so she's back for her revenge against any camp counselor who gets in her way. Friday the 13th, folks, the original masterpiece. Next up, we have one of the scariest movies of all time, without a doubt, and that's Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Some people might argue that, oh, it's not a slasher film because it's not a lone killer. So what? It's a whole family of killers. What's scarier than that? And also you have the final survivor girl. This, I believe, was the first time that's ever been used. And that's used in every slasher movie. So a lot of the slasher tropes that we all know and love today came from Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And of course you have that iconic horror villain in Leatherface, based on the exploits of real-life serial killer Ed Gein. It's such an incredibly scary film. It's incredibly well directed, incredibly well acted, and so realistic. And who could possibly beat that incredible dinner scene? I've never seen an example of madness better than that particular scene. It's just incredibly demented. And it's great how Sally is able to escape the clutches of this entire family of lunatics. So the Texas Chainsaw Massacre in at number 3. Next up, we have what I feel is the most influential film for the slasher genre, and that is Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. So without this film, you don't have Halloween. And without Halloween, you don't have the slasher boom of the 1980s. So no film, in my opinion, is more influential on the slasher genre than Psycho. And it's just so brilliant. It's so brilliantly acted by Anthony Perkins as Norman Bates and by Janet Leigh as Marion Crane. And what a great chemistry they have. And how shocking is it that they kill off the main character in the middle of the film. And so there you have the lone slasher killer in Norman Bates. He's demented. He's obsessed with his deceased mother, and he carries her conscience around within him, and that drives him to kill. Norman Bates in Psycho, directed by the great Alfred Hitchcock, in at number 2. So in at number 1 is Halloween, the number 1 slasher film of all time, starring the boogeyman Michael Myers, the ultimate original unstoppable killer, terrorizing the sleepy town of Haddonfield and terrorizing young Laurie Strode and her best friends. And also the great Donald Pleasence stars as Dr. Loomis, Michael's psychiatrist. So Michael escapes from the sanitarium 15 years after he murdered his own sister at 6 years old. So the boogeyman returns to terrorize the town of Haddonfield and pick everyone off one by one in the greatest slasher film of all time, in my opinion, and that is Halloween, directed by John Carpenter. And that's my picks, folks, for the top 10 slasher movies of all time. Thank you for joining me, Sean Patrick Erschen, in the Horror Corner. And let me know what you guys think is your favorite slasher films. Give me your top 10. Let me know what you guys thought of my top 10. Or what you would have included and what you wouldn't have included on this list. Let me know. And thank you for joining me in the Horror Corner. Tune in and stay scared.